Hi, my name's Zachary, Angela, and I'm going to be going over Go servers kind of step by step. Um, I think I went over them before, but just wanted to take it in a slower pace and try to explain it line by line. For people who don't know much about servers, I was just going to give you my mental model and everything of kind of what's going on, so you feel more comfortable. Um, so, anyways, the way I think of a server is like a for loop that just continually runs like forever. And when you go to visit a page, you're making a request toward a server like this, going to google.com. You're making a request to Google to pull this page in. And you can kind of visually see that when you go to network and you go to the page again. You kind of see you request URL, request method is to get, is when you're getting some, your use get. Status code 200 basically means that it's working correctly. And this is their address, and this is their origin, which is basically you have the ability to visit this page on their domain, right? Um, a lot of this stuff may be used for all different stuff for like caching and everything. Content type is just text or HTML, so you get a web page. Um, cookie information, and cookie is just basically a piece of information that's saved on your browser from their server. Um, yeah, there's different kind of methods that they use to send it. Um, how big the body response is. What does it look like? And here's the response back is basically a bunch of HTML. This is sort of where it came from throughout the different domains when it finally came to your computer, and maybe the different JavaScript that's involved. And here are the different cookies from it. Um, so the way I drew it out here is, um, here's the user, your browser. You make a request. They may have middleware, which I guess technically this is inside the server. And this is the server, which is the big circle. And then the request is within the handler. Handler you can think of as just like a function that runs. Kind of like here, it just runs whenever somebody goes to that certain URL. And then the response is whatever you're sending them back. And so a middleware, well, let me go over it like just a simpler echo sense as far as servers. Um, so this would be creating an instance of an echo server, or maybe you could say loading up the object or whatever. And here's the port that it would run on. This port, your computer has a lot of ports that may be open, but this one you're directing it when somebody goes into that port and visits your computer, even though I don't have any actually open, I'm just trying to make a comparison to the server. When they visit this port, that's when your server runs or the logic begins or whatever it is inside your computer. Because you have to have a port open to have a server get traffic in. So, um, you can set up the kind of I guess this would be, well, it's a port, but it's kind of in a sense like a subdom or segment of the URL. I mean, it's two different things. There's ports on the server, and then there's the URL, and the URL just happens to be tied to the port that's on your server. And then you have your other segment. So basically, you could think of this as a for loop that runs. This big circle thing you could think of as a for loop that just runs and runs until a request is made, and then all of a sudden it has to do something from the user. And what that something is kind of up to the backend person, right? It may hit a middleware, it may just go straight to the handler, whatever it is. And so, I mean, there's different security things behind it as well, which you could kind of say is like a middleware in a sense. But some of them have certificates. And a certificate is something kind of directly from whatever your hosting is, or it could be another means. It basically says when you visit, this URL, it's verified that you're actually hitting that site from their hosting, or however they got the certificate. And so, because people can mock up this URL and or redirect you somehow, and you may think you're going to their domain, but you may not be. And so the certificate kind of says, no, really, on Cloudflare or whatever it is, DigitalOcean, no, really, they're going to this website through that URL and getting the actual website that they should be getting. Um, so once you understand that it's just like a for loop sort of deal, and that you're getting in these requests and you're sending stuff back as a response, then you could kind of begin to understand, why you need to create handlers or middleware. And like I said, with a handler, you just think about it as a function that runs, and you set up the segment of the URL to know to run that function. So that when your server's running to make the request, you then, once it enters your server, then to run certain functions. And that's basically what's going on. So like this one, I have a server that's kind of running. It's on port 8080. It's on my computer. It's only localhost though. Doesn't have like a domain. And when a user goes to this URL, this function will run. When this function runs, it returns a string. That's basically it. So if I run this, and I visit hello, oh, misspelled it. You notice if I change this segment, it may or may not go to that page. But if I go to the right one, I should have done that. So now, should be running it and serving the string. It's what that it's not. This was though for some odd reason. So if we stop this, and then we go to it, it works. I'm not too sure why that didn't work here. I don't know. They look like they're exactly the same code. Oh, render. Is this one a string? Yeah, renders for files. I got that from the Echo site though. That's kind of weird. But anyways, um, so this would serve the string, and that's why when you go to visit that segment, it runs that function. And since I went to it, it ran that function and served me that string. So I'm the user. I went to 8080 with the localhost. I hit that handler because I went to that hello segment. And so when I got the request, my response was send that string. And that's basically what's going on. Um, So, you know, you're basically waiting for the for loop. Someone sends a request. You then get a handler per URL segment. And when it hits it, run this code. And so you can also serve files that way as well. So instead of just strings. So I have this is another handler. And if you go to something, it'll return a file and some HTML. And there's also some data involved with it. But basically, you're returning a file whenever somebody goes to this segment of the URL. So if we go to it, see it works because that file is being served. Hit refresh, something, this preview works, and went to that port, like I said, went to that segment. Um, and so there's just like a count of whatever's being returned as far as the file and everything. And yeah, these are kind of the means at which it's using by default. And the response is just this HTML, which is basically right here. This is the file that gets served. This was set up as I used Echo's templating. So we just went to templates. And oh, there you go. I basically took this code and we could use this one too if you wanted to get like more in depth with it. And yeah, you're just returning a file. So when you actually want to like use data in the file itself, and I understand that's kind of a weird concept. How can you use data in a file that's being served? Um, Basically, because your server understands syntax, when your server's running and it gets a response and it knows that certain segment of URL and it knows to return a file back down, before that file is sent, it's kind of like interpreted sort of by the server. And because of that, it knows kind of to change it sort of. And so you're using certain syntax to know that the server, when it interprets that syntax, when it sends the file down, to add data there when it sends it down. So you can't necessarily make this retroactive, right? You can't have data on here that's dynamic. So if the user doesn't do anything and then have that data be updated without them making a response back to your server, it ain't going to work that way. You can run JavaScript to change things on their browser when they receive the file. But as far as data that's from your server, they have to make a response back and then it has to get back. Unless you use WebSockets where it's kind of constantly going back and forth every second. But for the most part, when it's server side, you make the certain syntax. The Go server knows about the syntax. So when it sends it back down, it knows to add that data. Because you made a handler that said, when you use this name, use this data. Right? So if we run it, and we go back, see, instead of it showing name here, it used Dolly. Because before you sent the file, it knew that syntax meant Dolly. Um, so moving on past request response sort of stuff. I mean, with requests, um, you can do form data. So when you visit a page, you made a response, you got back the file, but that file has a form on it. When you fill out that form, it makes a request back to the server. The form does as a response back to the server, a specific one, different from serving the file. Because like when I do this, you notice it pulled up all this information. So it makes a response back to the server to know to change things. But that's all on the response end. Again, you're making something on the response before you serve something back, basically. So if you're just doing this, this ain't going to be uh, or this is a request kind of code. It's not a response because you're not sending anything to the user back. Same thing with here. This is just part of the request. Is when they hit your server, it runs this code, but then doesn't send anything back. But then when you do this, it's sending something back. And that's kind of the point of request response that you're always making. With the parameters, again, it knows in the background that when you make a certain request toward the server, do something with this data that's in the URL. This is still part of the request, and then make the response. So you're just constantly doing that. As far as like middleware, again, that's something that's inside the server still, but it usually runs before it hits that handler function. So, why is there a difference? Well, you need it to redirect some URLs. So why would you have a URL go to something you don't want? Well, you may have a system that generates URLs for the user, and they may have some third party come in and say, oh, we want all these pages that you made, the 100 of them, we want it to go somewhere else. So redirect them. And that's maybe why you want a middleware to run when a request hits the server to do something else, to know then maybe to redirect them to a different URL or something like that, because there may be other people involved. You may want to do some kind of logging. So when a certain request hits the server and hits a certain URL or segment, you may want it to log. You would do that for, I don't know, testing. You would do that for security. You'd do that if they're making a payment or something. You want to know what's going on in that middleware before it hits the handler. gzip is just like another way to send files. It kind of shortens them up, I guess you could say, and then sends them out. Recover is more like you wrote some code, it didn't quite do what you wanted because the program may be so big and there may be other people working on it, and you don't want the whole thing to shut down because somebody made, they forgot a character or something like that. That would be a way to do it so that the server keeps accepting responses even though the code isn't quite right. Basic auth is basically when you log into something, you send your username and password. Again, you'd want to have that hit or be in the middleware first so that they can't get to certain pages or whatever until they sign in. JWT is just like another kind of authentication, but it has a lot more to do with keys and claims and all that, and it's just a more complicated version of username password. Security, again, is I kind of went over that with the certificates and everything. It's just a way to block out crawlers because there's constantly crawlers hitting your site, Google, Bing, whatever, and you or someone's doing some malicious crawler code and you want to block them, basically. CORS is a handshake between your URLs and the data that you serve. You may have an iframe where it holds certain data, but you only want it to show on a certain page because someone might go into your code, you know, steal that image or iframe and put it on their site. Well, now you're serving their iframe, basically. So what CORS is basically says, no, really, you have to be on this URL in order to even see it. Otherwise, it won't even be served. It's just another way to have kind of like security. Static, again, is serving like images or JavaScript or whatever, or CSS. And that, again, is part of the middleware because you want that security first, not just a segment of the URL and you get everything. It's a way to run through stuff first and then decide what you want to serve them. Um, there's a lot of stuff with that you can just so much logging, you know. You could get complicated with it. Sessions, which is just a way to tie it to the server so that for security reasons you want to keep it going. Uh, yeah. Um, so you got load balancer, which basically means you have, let's say, a server running on 8081 port, and you have another server running on this port. So it's like running two different Go applications or files or whatever you want to call it. And let's say this one's the old one, and you want to upgrade to this one. But if it's like a payment service or something like that 1,000 people are hitting a day, you can't just shut this off. There's just too much money you're gonna lose. So a load balancer basically says uh, send a certain percentage to this server over here. Maybe on AWS, and your old server may be on Google App Engine or something, but it knows to direct it toward the other server. And so you kind of get to control what that means. And you would do that so that you could kind of migrate users to this other server that you is updated and better. But you want to take everything down. um, there's also like proxies, which is a way to make it seem like you're going to this certain URL or you're visiting a certain domain, but you're really hitting up assets or whatever on another one. And so you're kind of like mimicking a website. And why would you do that? If you're changing like URLs or whatever, or you have a website that runs and you don't want crawlers or something to hit it. So they think they're going to that URL, the crawlers do, but really you're sending them over here because you know that they're crawlers. And so they don't slow down your site. You have this other mock server that serves the same kind of files for SEO for the crawlers, but it's not slowing down the server that your users go to. So that's sort of a way to send traffic to a different place because you don't want to slow down that server. Because crawlers will just bombard your server, you know, especially depending on how popular it is, how much there's SEO involved, how much Google thinks it's important, or Facebook or whatever. So it's just a way to direct traffic to make it seem like they're hitting that server, but they're really hitting a different server. There's a lot more use cases there, but I'm just trying to come up with an example. Um, a lot of these with streaming response is more like um, WebSockets and stuff, where it's just constant. Like if you're doing a game, you need to see where the other player's moving. Well, every time they move on your web page, that's from the server, and so that server constantly has to communicate with your web page to know the bad guy or the second player is moving across the screen. Um, yeah, I think that's the gist of kind of what's going on with a server, at least from a basic standpoint. If I go any further, I feel like I'm getting away from the server. I'm getting more into details of middlewares or security or authentication. But yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. All right. Thank you.